Law 201 Case Study Part 5: Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Who, what, where, and why. This presentation will focus on the national epidemic happening in Canada of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. Aboriginal women and girls have been going missing and being murdered at alarming rates, higher than any other demographic in Canada. This is happening all over Canada, especially in areas with preserves. A pattern of victimization has shown throughout the years of Aboriginal women and girls. As a result, many protests have occurred, and a national inquiry has begun this year to look into the matter. Historical context. According to a report by the NWAC, the issues of modern-day Aboriginal women and girls stem from the horrors suffered during colonization. Aboriginal people have had to adapt to European beliefs, assimilated, religiously converted, and have experienced cultural genocide. The suffering has continued since then, and women have suffered the most. Aboriginal women are more susceptible to violence, specifically domestic violence. This inquiry notes that the justice system has done little to protect them from any of these assaults. Statistics. It is estimated that there are close to 600 cases of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada, dating back to the 1960s, but the Native Women's Association of Canada says more cases have gone undocumented. A 2014 report by the RCMP concluded closer to 1,017 Aboriginal women were missing or murdered. This is much higher than the rate for other groups of women in Canada. These graphs show the difference between Indigenous women and the rest of the population of women murder rates. So it shows that Indigenous women make up 4% of the population, female population, and 16% of the murder population of women. Aboriginal women in Canada also experience consistently higher rates of reported intimate violence than overall female population. 1 in 3 Aboriginal women is abused by a partner, compared to 1 in 10 women overall. It is stated that 75% of Aboriginal women for whom information was available had childhood and adolescent experience of abuse. 90% of Aboriginal women and only 61% of non-Aboriginal women have been physically abused. Protests. There have been many protests from Aboriginal communities and supporters wanting answers and help from the Canadian government regarding this issue. Protests such as the Sisters in Spirit Vigil, going on its 8th year, is one of 216 held across the country that honor the missing and murdered women, as well as demand justice. These heartbreaking vigils and protests allow Aboriginal families to remember their loved ones and have their voices heard. These protesters argue that the lives of Aboriginals are not valued, as the treatment of missing and murdered women's cases is not as serious as those for other groups. On October 4th, 500 people marched through Montreal to demand justice for Indigenous victims of crime, the 11th annual march of its kind in Montreal. This day is also billed as National Day of Vigil for missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. As a result of the protests and demands to the federal government, a national inquiry has been issued to look into the matter. The Liberal Party platform originally estimated the cost of a full national public inquiry at $40 million over 2 years starting in 2016. Despite the large funding, there have been many delays and problems that have resulted in starting the inquiry, and it has not begun until this year. In May 2017, a group of 30 advocates published an open letter voicing their concerns as a result of delays and lack of information given to the Aboriginal families wishing to participate. They stated that the inquiry had failed to announce its timelines and issue regular progress reports. The commissioner, it says, has created a sense of desperation and urgency by not communicating regularly, and the money spent up to date has not been used properly towards the family and to engage in the process. This resulted in a news conference from the Chief of Inquiry promising for more transparency. Despite this claim, there still has been many issues during this process. In June, 4 head staffers of the Inquiry Commission resigned, including the executive director, creating more worry about the direction the inquiry was heading. The inquiry held its first public hearing in Whitehorse May 30th to June 2nd and announced plans to delay testimony from other families until an undetermined date in the fall. The first public hearing was held in a large white tent next to the Yukon River so that it would not have such a courtroom feel, and this was a test to see how the inquiry would go and the process that would follow. There was a traditional ceremony and families were able to share their stories. Legal context. This issue relates to law not only criminally because of the violence inflicted to Aboriginal women and girls, but human rights as well. The Native Women's Association of Canada and the Feminist Alliance for International Action published a list of recommendations for the upcoming national inquiry, stating that Canadian law has failed Aboriginal women and it does not help the problem at hand. It stated, missing and murdered Indigenous women are a consequence of state lawlessness created by Canadians' law's inability to deal with the ongoing aftermath of colonialism and its attendant violence. These spaces of lawlessness are also the result of the denial of Indigenous laws and legal orders since the arrival of settlers, says the report, based on the discussions at the symposium on the inquiry in Ottawa. Some of these recommendations include 1. Examination of failures in policing and the justice system, the underlying social and economic inequality of Indigenous women and girls that permits and perpetuates the violence, as well as establishing a human rights framework for the inquiry that will ensure that recommendations already made by the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission are implemented that proposed solutions against human rights standards. Indigenous Affairs Minister Caroline Bennett says she is considering ways to incorporate Indigenous law to the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women. This legal context, it also applies because it's important that moving forward that Aboriginal law is held at the same esteem as Canadian law and that we help the Aboriginal people going forward.